this is an important session because it's the memorial lecture, and this is our 10th memorial lecture, which this year focuses on the horse in China. And you'll recall that when I started, I whittled on about various things about the Chinese New Year and all that sort of stuff. So this is actually a really important subject, and I'm delighted that we got Naomi Mellor, Chief Executive of the Thoroughbred Breeders Association, to introduce our guest speaker. So Naomi, over to you.
Thank you, Tim. Your Royal Highness, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this afternoon's memorial lecture, which in a slight departure from the norm is not actually going to be a lecture, it's going to be a conversation. As Tim said, I am the CEO of the Thoroughbred Breeders Association, and I'm still not entirely sure how I ended up with this privileged position, but thank you to the wizardry of the NEF Organising Committee. I have the privilege of spending the next 20 minutes or so with our guest for this afternoon. And the person joining me on stage for the memorial lecture this afternoon is Professor Chris Riggs. So welcome, Chris. Just before we start, a little tiny bit of housekeeping. I'm not going to do my full British Airways rigmarole, but we're only taking questions from Slido for this afternoon, please. So for everyone in the room and those watching online via Clip My Horse, just submit your questions via Slido and we will pick them up at the end. So Professor Chris Riggs, who is joining us this afternoon, will be well known to many of you. He is the director of the Equine Welfare Research Foundation and the chief advisor to Mainland Veterinary engagement from the Hong Kong Jockey Club. Chris has been with the Hong Kong Jockey Club for a very long time and will be well known to many of you. He's an extremely modest man, and he will not like me saying this, but he is also the person who I think knows more about equine bone than anyone in the world. And if you have had anything to do with lameness or fractures or orthopedics at any stage as an owner or vet or anything else, you have probably benefited from Chris's research and his wisdom, because he literally wrote the book. So we are very privileged to have him here today, and we are going to be having a chat about China, as Tim said. So the title of this talk is Changing Priorities, the Horse in China, Evolving Values and Progress in Equine Veterinary Care. And Chris, you first went to China in the early 2000s after you'd been in Hong Kong for about a year. How did you end up in Hong Kong in the first place, and what was it like in Hong Kong and China when you first went there, from a horse perspective?
Well, thank you very much for the invitation to chat, and certainly it's very kind words of you, but not true right at the start. But I ended up being approached about the job in the Hong Kong Jockey Club. They were looking to expand the veterinary department. Initially, there was one department doing regulation and clinical, and they wanted to separate those roles for transparency, for perception, all those issues. So they wanted someone else to develop and further expand the clinical department. And I was approached about that job. And having been to Hong Kong once before, thinking, oh my God, who could live here? I ended up being there and then having 23 or 22 fantastic years there. It's an amazing place. I arrived in Hong Kong with my family in 2003, and my first trip into Chinese mainland was in 2004.
Amazing. And this year, as Tim said, is the Chinese Year of the Horse, and it is the Chinese Year of the Fire Horse, no less, which only happens once every 80 years. The horse is very revered in China. Do you want to just talk a little bit about culturally how horses were relevant, both prior to your arrival and kind of over the years in China, Chris?
Yeah, sure. There's been a very, very long-standing, huge respect for the horse throughout China. And you don't need to go very far before you'll come across cultural artifacts, paintings, historical stories about the horse. And of course, we all know about Genghis Khan and lots of warriors in China. And I imagine, being such a big country as well, there's a huge need for good horsemanship to be able to conquer various things. And most of that was initially centered more up north and western China, so Xinjiang province, Inner Mongolia, as well as sort of central areas like Sichuan. And the horse played a very, very important role militarily, but also in transport and general functional roles. There are other areas of horse use in China which we may not be so familiar with, which is obviously mare's milk, and fermented mare's milk, which I've only had once on the Mongolian grasslands, and once is enough, I think, probably. It's hard for us to really put it in context, I think, when you think of the hardships that many, many people in China would have gone through within the lifespan of many of people living here. And it's very easy to be critical of how far behind they've been in many areas, but actually what was far more important was finding food for yourself and your family, and not to be able to indulge in luxuries. And the horse population in China, amazingly, in the early 1990s was about 11 million. And it's dropped off precipitously since then, down to about 3.5 million now. And it's really only over the last sort of 5 years that's leveled out and just starting to climb a little bit again.
And what's been responsible for that massive population decline, Chris? Because you mentioned that to me and I was going to pick it up because it's an enormous drop in numbers.
Yes, I think the obvious explanation for that is the lack of relevance and lack of importance. Not needed militarily, not needed for transport, not needed for operations. And again, it used to be illegal to have pets in cities in China because that was a waste of food. But also there was a rabies concern and things like that. So again, it's very hard to culturally put yourself in the place of what it must really have been like that. This was a luxury that was not needed anymore, or it had become a luxury and as such was unnecessary. So not only, I think, was it just something that couldn't be afforded, but also probably seen as a bit bourgeoisie as well.
But culturally, the horse is very important in tourism and in quite a lot of kind of celebration pieces as well. Yes. Can you talk a little bit about that, Chris?
Yes, it really is, and probably really expanding on that. Like recently, and in a couple of recent trips up to Xinjiang, so that's right in the far northwest of China, and it's an area where there's been some international political concern over various things, but when I've been there, I've found it incredibly interesting, very welcoming, warm people from many, many different ethnic backgrounds, but the horse is very important there. And certainly the Yili pony, which is the sort of local horse around there, is really revered, and they're really, really proud about those, and they're very, very tough, durable ponies. So they often will stage in various places sort of recreations of Genghis Khan storming around the plains and things like that, which are quite popular for people to come and see, and various other horse displays, some of them which would definitely cock an eyebrow a bit from some sort of welfare type elements to them. You know, they're not what we would think would be the best thing, but there is this real interest among people to see the horse in that scenario.
And just before we touch on welfare, you mentioned about the population just starting to recover. What's been the sort of precipitating factors there, Chris, and how do you think that's turning around?
Well, certainly a thing that made a big impact, and a big impact from what I saw anyway in much of China, was 2008 and the Beijing Olympics. It's slightly ironic that the equestrian events of the 2008 Beijing Olympics could not be held in Chinese mainland, and that was because of health arrangements and health agreements internationally, and once a horse went into China, it wasn't coming back out again. And so therefore, actually, the games, the equestrian events of the games were held in Hong Kong, where we do have good international health arrangements. But there was this huge interest in equestrian events that came from that, and probably other things that are going on, and an increased wealth of the population, and ability to invest in this, and an interest in doing so. And inevitably, it's a thing that sort of shows you off as being slightly in a higher part of society, that you could afford to be involved in that. So there's a status aspect to it all as well. And so there's this been greatly increasing interest in equestrian sports, etc. I mean, looking back, for instance, back in 2009, there were a handful of riding clubs, whereas now there are 2,500 registered clubs, and probably a lot more than that now, in terms of registered athletes, FEI athletes, FEI horses and FEI events. They've gone up 2,000% or so, 3,000%, I think, for the horses since 2009. So a huge interest in wanting to succeed globally in equestrian competitions.
And one of the things I was really staggered about when we chatted initially on this was you talked about the veterinary backdrop to your career in Hong Kong and the lack of availability of quite commonly used drugs in this country and in other European nations, even now. Can you talk a little bit about that and how things changed over your time in Hong Kong and what we might expect that might not be available there?
Well, from a medication point of view, there's virtually nothing, nothing registered for the horse. There are medicines which are available for veterinary use, which are quite distinct from those that can be used in humans. So it is illegal in China to use a medicine that's registered for people in animals.
Okay.
But the veterinary medicines do vary very, very greatly in quality. And certainly the dose of xylazine, which would be available, that would have any effect, would vary very, very greatly between which bottle you use. That's just an example. Ironically, one of the things over the years that has been a huge welfare issue is how to euthanize a horse, and the absence of a drug that can be used effectively to achieve humane euthanasia. And that's still a problem. And I wouldn't like to tell you some of the products that have been used by people at various stages to try and put horses to sleep. So that is an important example of a difference. There is a grey market of medicines, inevitably they get in there, and there are increasing numbers of semi-legal or sometimes maybe legal routes for more Western medicines to get in, but there is still, that is a great obstacle for which people are working hard to find solutions.
And I think it's something that's not really known about. Obviously, in the Hong Kong Jockey Club is a bastion of excellence across lots of worlds, including racing and horse sports, but the awareness of the fact that you're working in an environment that might be quite different was certainly a surprise to me, let's put it that way.
Yes, of course, I would emphasize, of course, what it is very much one country, two systems. What goes on in Hong Kong is just the same as what all of us sitting here, access to medicines, etc., is very easy. We set up a race course, which from a horse welfare point of view, was the best thing we've ever done, I think, at the Hong Kong Jockey Club. This race course at Chonghua in South Guangdong Province. And the reason for doing that was we were limited to what we could do in Hong Kong because of space, etc. And we built this new race course in this beautiful area. There's no racing there at the moment. Horses train there and then shuttle backwards and forwards from there to Hong Kong and race. And horses do incredibly well there. The horse that's been there for a week, they find suddenly it's very different. It's really relaxed. You talk to the work riders. They love it up there. Our great horse, Kai Ying Rising, which is the best horse in the world at the moment, probably is like that because it can go up to Chonghua and love it up there, really relax. And the people are fantastic up there. And it's been this amazing opportunity for local and further away people to be involved in sort of cutting edge, in that instance, racing work. We have all the medicines we want there, but that's through very, very protracted and detailed work with various government ministries in China to find exemptions, find solutions for being able to get medicines in. And it's very difficult. We have to jump through a lot of hoops and have very, very tight restrictions on how those drugs and managed, etc.
But welfare is something that you've had an awful long interest in as part of your work in mainland China as well.
Yeah.
And the Equine Welfare Research Foundation was established. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that, Chris, and why it was set up and what the sort of work that it's been doing in China?
Well, the Equine Welfare Research Foundation is a different thing, really. That's really focused on trying to make our contribution to improving the quality of life of the thoroughbred racehorse, particularly in training and racing and in retirement from racing. And that's really helping the club to do its bit globally to make things better from racing. We all know there are problems in racing. There are great things about it, but there are problems. And the only way racing will be able to survive is to acknowledge that and then work very hard to find solutions for them and be seen to be doing so, not necessarily shout about it, but it be obvious because we are trying to make it better. So it's our contribution to try to do that. So that's a global thing. We'd love to fund studies in China. We'd love to fund studies in Hong Kong. But what's important for that is funding high quality work that might have an impact. Separately, we're doing other things in China to help with veterinary education because veterinary education has been a long way behind what we would expect in the West in terms of training people to be competent clinicians. It's been very research focused and it's very difficult. Again, those people were set up to prevent spread of disease really among livestock. Again, feeding people, not looking after a redundant species, if you like. And so there's been an absence of people to be able to do that. And so we're trying to do our bit to help regenerate that and reinvigorate that.
And that veterinary education piece feels like something that's been moving along quite well quite recently from what you said, that there's a lot of enthusiasm amongst the younger generation coming through and they're viewing their capacity to treat horses in a little bit of a different way.
Yes, absolutely. In the time I've been lucky enough to be engaged, I've seen a big difference. There were a lot of students who went to vet schools because it was an easy way to get into a good university. It had nothing to do with veterinary science as such. Whereas now it's very much more, there would be more people who are motivated to be doing it for the animals. Also, there have been various other programs. There's a US-China Animal Health Alliance, which has had a program of training every year 5 really high-performing veterinary graduates from China taken to the States doing the DVM, and they've gone back, and they're really helping to drive change. And a handful of those have gone into equine work. I know them all, most of them quite well, really lovely people, but very tough for them because they are coming in, parachuting into an existing units full of grey-haired old fellas like me, trying to get them to change. And also they have no access to drugs or equipment and things like that. And we're trying to help a little bit with that. And a lot of those are some great people in that who are leading development, but they need a lot of support.
And you mentioned encouraging people to change there, and we've talked a little bit about sort of encouraging development in a different culture. And can you talk a little bit about how you've gone about that, Chris? Because I know that this challenging with grace and respect is something that's really important to you and has really underpinned a lot of the work that you've done. Can you touch a little bit on how that has shaped your career?
Yes, I would love to think it always would have been with grace and respect, but I know myself well enough to know that it wouldn't have been. But I have found, I put over the years a lot of time getting dirty and drinking a lot of baijiao, which is a very strong drink, and that's important with forging relationships, doing that. And so when I'm critical, which I have been very vocally, people seem to accept that. I would say graciously and gratefully, and they know it. A lot of really good people who really care about it. Like there's one person who really was a big influence, Jia Ling, who used to be the chief veterinary officer, and he used to, at one stage, long ago in his career, he did his rounds on horseback in Inner Mongolia. And I have a huge respect for him, and he really cared. He could see what needed to be done. He saw how important it was to invest in the young people and things like that. So it's been a huge treat for me to get to meet people like that and want to help because of people like that, and also all the young people who want to be good but couldn't be good because they couldn't get access to the training.
And just finally, I'm conscious of time, but what about looking to the future, Chris? Because China is a massively developed, rapidly developed country, and it's absolutely sensational what's been going on there in lots of ways. And how do you see the future shaking out from a veterinary education perspective and particularly an equine welfare perspective, I guess?
Well, I think from a veterinary educational perspective, there will be transition to more focus on clinical competences, etc. I think at the moment the veterinary profession is not very regulated in China. It's a bit of the Wild West, certainly in the small animal practice. Often it seems more like an industry than a profession, but I'm worried that's happening elsewhere in the West, etc. I think, I really hope some of the young people, one of the things I've seen in China is often a real focus on get-rich-quick mentality, which absolutely is not what's required. What's obviously required is a real desire to build solid foundations and roots and slowly build up from that and really get owners on board. That's a big problem. Owners would never trust a Chinese vet if it's made in China. Chinese don't trust it, you want something from the West. So changing that mentality, and about the only positive thing I've ever seen in hideous COVID is that might have helped that, because then they had to use Chinese vets to do that, which they didn't have to do before. And there are some great young people who, with the opportunity, will be among the best in the world, definitely. And that is happening.
Yeah, that's wonderful, and I think there's an exciting future ahead. I'm going to pick up just one question before we run out of time, which is actually about African horse sickness, Chris. In Southeast Asia, how concerned are you in the Chinese horse community about the risks represented on that?
Yeah, absolutely. That is a very real risk, and of course that came very, very close to eventuating when they had the outbreak of African horse sickness in Thailand recently, a few years ago. From spreading out from zebras, and it was an amazing effort in Thailand to contain it. Of course, Thailand is extremely close with China, and there was a real risk. Probably that's the best area of veterinary operations, disease monitoring and control. So, and what tends to happen is if you have a regulation in one country, for instance, the quarantine regulations or import-export regulations associated with Olympics, then when it came to the Asian Games, the Chinese will take that and make it twice as hard. So they're often very tough on those sort of quarantine and health regulations. So I think that's one area I'd have more confidence than other areas. But yes, of course, it's a huge country. With a huge country comes some real problems of keeping tabs on everything.
Yeah, it's a future challenge, but a future opportunity as well that we hope goes well. If anyone else has any further questions, do pop them into the Slido, because we're going to try and get Chris to answer a couple more as well when we've finished. But that is about all we've got time for. Professor Chris Riggs, everybody, he's a wonderful person. Thank you very much.